There's a question that almost nobody asks about the Sumerian underworld, and it might be the most important one. If the gates were designed to sort the dead and ensure they all found passage below, then who designed the gates? And if those gates could reject souls, refuse passage, trap them on the surface indefinitely, what does that say about who built that system and what they were actually trying to do? For decades, scholars have treated the Sumerian underworld like a neutral force, a cosmic inevitability, an impersonal consequence of death. The gates are there, the dead pass through, the system operates, but the tablet we're about to discuss today, one that has sat labeled as damaged and incomplete for nearly a century, tells a completely different story. It doesn't just describe souls who can't pass. It describes something far more deliberate, a system, a mechanism, gatekeepers who have reasons for turning souls away. And when you start asking why certain souls were rejected, the entire narrative shifts. Because rejection implies judgment. Judgment implies standards. Standards imply someone or something with the power to decide who moves on and who gets trapped. This isn't a story about the afterlife anymore. It's a story about control. The Sumerians, and I want to be very clear about this, were not superstitious people scratching desperate prayers into clay. They were the civilization that built the first cities, created the first written laws, developed mathematics so sophisticated that modern astronomers still don't fully understand how accurate their calculations were. When they wrote about the underworld, they weren't making up mythology, they were describing infrastructure. The Sumerian underworld, Kur, was not a place of punishment in the way later religions conceived it, but it was also not a place of reward. It was presented as a gray house, a place of rest, but also of finality, permanent, complete. A soul that reached Kur stopped being hungry, stopped wanting, stopped raging, stopped hoping. It achieved what the Sumerians called the sweet sleep, and that was supposed to be the mercy of it. But here's what matters. Only souls that could prove themselves worthy of that mercy were allowed to enter. The five gates of Kur didn't just let everyone through. At each gate stood a guardian. At each gate something was taken away. Clothing, status, memory, flesh, hope. By the time you reached the final gate, you weren't even fully you anymore. You were stripped down to something essential, something that could finally rest. But the process assumed you could make it through all five gates. The Sumerian texts that scholars have found and translated thousands of times, they never question this assumption. Everyone passes through. Everyone reaches the bottom. Everyone finds rest. Except this tablet says something different. It doesn't list the gates. It lists the souls that get turned away before they ever reach the first gate. And the reason that matters, the reason this changes everything, is that it implies there was a vetting process, an assessment, a system of criteria. The tablet itself is preserved in what we would call a damaged condition. But here's something the museum catalogs have never mentioned. The damage isn't random. The erosion pattern shows that something was deliberately rubbed away, multiple sections, and the translation has always been marked incomplete. But the completeness isn't really the issue. The issue is that someone decided this tablet was saying something that needed to be hidden. Modern translators, Akkadianists and cuneiform specialists, they've known for decades that the erosion was deliberate, but you report what you're supposed to report. You check the boxes on the catalog. You label it incomplete. You place it on a lower shelf where graduate students rarely look. And you move on to the tablets that tell the story everyone already knows. But here's what makes this tablet so unsettling when you actually translate what remains. The five conditions the scribe lists aren't about people who were evil, they're about people who were incomplete. People who were missing something essential. Souls that came to the first gate broken in specific ways, and the gatekeeper took one look and said no. The first of the five conditions, and this is where it starts to get uncomfortable, describes someone the Sumerians called the shattered witness, someone who lived an entire life seeing everything but understanding nothing, who watched events unfold, experienced moments, accumulated experiences, but never integrated them into anything meaningful. Someone who could remember the surface of things, but never the connections between them. To a modern listener, that sounds almost like dissociation, or depersonalization, or perhaps something like autism spectrum presentation, or ADHD, or trauma-induced fragmentation. But the Sumerians didn't have those words. What they had was a term that meant someone who lived through life, but never lived in it. And the tablet says, and I want to read this carefully because the surviving text here is actually quite clear. It says the warning sign that this condition is already taking hold in a living person is the sensation of being a permanent observer, of watching your own life like it's happening to someone else, of having memories that feel borrowed rather than lived. The scribe writes that by the time these people reached the gates of Kur, they hadn't actually been alive long enough to qualify for rest. They'd been ghosts already, standing in the living world, accumulating time but not meaning. The second condition is called the voice that cannot be heard. And this one is genuinely strange, because it's not about someone who was literally silent. It's about someone whose words, no matter how loudly they spoke, no matter how clear their meaning, never actually landed. Someone who spent their entire existence being misunderstood. Not because they were inarticulate, but because of something about them that made genuine understanding impossible. The tablet describes this as a soul condition that was nearly impossible to notice while someone was living, because they would speak, they would try, they would repeat themselves, but every word would hit an invisible wall. The warning sign is subtler than the first condition. It's the creeping awareness that your explanations never quite work, that people always slightly misinterpret what you meant, that even people who love you seem to be relating to a version of you that doesn't quite exist. The gatekeeper would recognize this soul immediately, the tablet says, because such a soul could never truly join the collective rest of Kur. It could never integrate. It would spend eternity trying to explain itself to the dust, and the dust would never understand. Better to leave it above, the gatekeeper reasons, where at least it had tried. The third condition is perhaps the most immediately recognizable to modern people. The tablet calls it the hunger that feeds on itself. It describes people whose needs were inverted, people who sought to fill internal voids by consuming more objects, more relationships, more experiences, more meaning. But the filling never worked. The hunger only grew. Every consumption fed the void instead of satisfying it. The warning sign for this condition, according to the tablet, was a particular kind of exhaustion, not the tiredness of work, but the exhaustion of constant deficiency. A person could have everything, wealth, relationships, status, pleasure, and still feel like they were starving. The scribe wrote that these people often lived intensely, burned through experiences quickly, collected things and people and achievements, but they moved through life like something was chasing them. The gatekeeper would reject this soul because it would never achieve rest. Even in the gray house, even stripped of all external things, it would still be hungry. It would still be searching. That kind of incompleteness was a curse, and Kur was supposed to be mercy. So the gatekeeper would turn it away, leave it above, condemned to keep searching forever. The fourth condition is where the tablet becomes almost clinical in its precision. It's called the breaker of patterns, and it describes people who lived outside of any consistent framework, people who experienced reality in ways that didn't align with the normal structures. The Sumerians had very specific ideas about how reality worked, about cycles and patterns and repetitions. But some people, the tablet says, couldn't sustain those patterns. Their experience of time was different. Their logic didn't follow expected sequences. Their behavior couldn't be predicted or standardized. In a civilization obsessed with order, with accounting, with the 7 gates and the 7 guardians and the 7-fold progression, such people were almost incomprehensible. And the warning sign that you might be this type while still alive was the growing sense that you didn't quite fit the mold, that your thinking didn't align with everyone else's thinking, that your perception of cause and effect was just slightly off from consensus reality. The gatekeeper would recognize this immediately, because such a soul would be chaos in the orderly progression downward. Every gate assumes a certain kind of being moving through it. This soul would break that assumption. It would try to go sideways at gates designed for downward movement. It would see choices where there were none. Better to leave it above, the gatekeeper decides, where it can be broken, in a world that's used to breaking. The fifth condition is the one that the museum catalog says is too damaged to translate, but it's not. The text is actually quite intact. It's the condition itself that's so damaging to read that someone somewhere decided it needed to be erased from the historical record. The fifth condition is called the burden bearer, and it describes something that sounds at first almost noble. People who carried weight for others. People who took on responsibility, pain, suffering that wasn't theirs to take. People who spent their lives trying to fix things, solve problems, carry loads that had nothing to do with them because they couldn't help themselves. The Sumerians, and this is critical, did not glorify this trait. They didn't see it as moral or beautiful. They saw it as a disease of the spirit. Someone who couldn't stop carrying other people's weight was someone whose own self had dissolved, someone who had become an object, a vessel, a tool. And such a soul, coming to the gates of Kur, would bring all that weight with it. The gatekeeper would refuse such a soul entry, because a burden bearer could never rest. It would always be looking around Kur for someone else to help, something else to carry. The gray house requires the ability to finally put things down. This soul would never be able to do that, so it would be trapped above, forever trying to carry things in a world that was too light for its burden. And here's what should genuinely unsettle you. The tablet doesn't just describe these 5 conditions in abstract terms. It provides the warning signs, the specific experiences you could have right now, while alive, that would indicate you're becoming one of these 5. And the fact that someone tried to erase that section, that someone looked at a 2,000-year-old document and decided it was too dangerous to preserve, suggests that whoever did the erasing knew exactly how applicable those warnings were to ordinary people. The really uncomfortable part is that most of us recognize ourselves in at least one of these 5, and the Sumerians were telling us, through a text that someone tried to bury, that this is something you can catch while you're still alive, that it's not something that happens at death, it's something that happens in the slow erosion of your actual aliveness. You become a shattered witness by checking out mentally from your own experiences. You become the voice that cannot be heard by learning that communication is hopeless. You become the hunger that feeds on itself by never feeling satisfied. You become the breaker of patterns by refusing to fit. You become the burden bearer by never setting anything down. By the time you reach whatever gates actually exist at the end of life, these conditions aren't new. They've been growing in you for years. Now, there's something that most commentary on this tablet completely misses. The standard interpretation is that these 5 souls are trapped on the surface of the world, unable to rest, unending ghosts of their own incompleteness. And that's terrible, sure, but there's another possibility, one that the Sumerian text actually hints at, but which requires you to question what trapped actually means. If you can't descend into Kur, that means you remain on the surface. And if you remain on the surface where the living walk, then you remain capable of affecting the living. You remain present. You remain, in a strange way, undead. And the tablet, the surviving parts anyway, seems to suggest that the 5 conditions don't just describe individual souls. They describe forces, patterns, things that can move through populations, can be caught by one person and transmitted to another. That's a reading that most Sumerian scholars avoid. It's uncomfortable. It suggests that the 5 types of souls aren't just doomed individuals. They're part of a system, and if they're part of a system, then the gatekeeper who rejects them isn't just providing mercy. The gatekeeper is maintaining something, preventing contamination, stopping something from entering Kur that would break the orderliness of the underworld itself. Which raises the question, who gave the gatekeeper that authority? And what happens if something that doesn't qualify for Kur simply becomes too prevalent in the living world? If too many shattered witnesses, if too many voices that cannot be heard, if too much hunger that feeds on itself. If we're looking at a system that was designed to maintain certain standards about who gets to cross over, and if these 5 conditions represent failures of that system, then what the Sumerians were actually documenting might not be an afterlife framework. It might be a population management strategy, a way of understanding what happens to people who don't fit the pattern. And whether you believe the Sumerians had supernatural knowledge or not, what's undeniable is this. They were describing specific human conditions that they'd observed. They were categorizing types of people, types of souls, and they were saying that certain configurations of human experience were incompatible with rest, incompatible with what they understood as the natural progression. If you want to dive deeper into what the recovered sections of the tablet actually say and what it might mean about the nature of consciousness and the boundaries between life and death, I've put together a full analysis in the pinned comment and description where you can explore the original Akkadian texts side by side with modern translations and actually see where the deliberate erasure occurred. There's a lot more to this than the surface. The deeper you look into these 5 conditions, the more you start to realize that the Sumerians weren't writing fiction. They were writing field notes. They were looking at people around them and noticing patterns, noticing that some people seemed to be already dead inside their lives, noticing that some people had given up on being understood, noticing that some people were consumed by voids they couldn't fill, noticing that some people couldn't conform to the basic patterns of society, noticing that some people were breaking themselves carrying everyone else. And they were saying, if you see these patterns in someone, if you start to recognize yourself in these descriptions, understand that you're already caught in something, not by supernatural forces, but by the patterns you're perpetuating, by the ways you've learned to relate to the world that have convinced you that you're somehow incompatible with rest, with completion, with the kind of closure that other people seem to achieve. The real horror of this tablet isn't that it describes ghosts. It's that it describes living people who are already half dead, people whose aliveness is leaking out through specific wounds, people who are accumulating a particular kind of spiritual damage that won't resolve itself, that will just keep growing, that will still be there at the end when the gates open and you find yourself unqualified to pass through. That's where we have to pause for now, because what comes next is understanding not just what the 5 conditions are, but what you can actually do if you recognize yourself in them. And that's going to require looking at what the Sumerians understood about reversal, about recovery, about how you essentially unbecome these things before it's too late. Because the implication of this tablet is that it's possible, that you could see these signs in yourself right now and address them. But if you wait until you're at the gates, if you arrive already broken in these specific ways, that's when the gatekeeper says no. The question then becomes urgent, because these 5 conditions the Sumerians described weren't meant to terrify you into paralysis. They were diagnostic. They were a map. And the clay tablet itself contains something most scholars missed entirely when they buried it under that damaged label. It contains a counter-instruction, a protocol. The scribe, whoever pressed that stylus into the wet clay thousands of years ago, didn't just warn about the 5 souls that cannot pass. He also embedded throughout the text specific practices that could interrupt the formation of each condition. And this is where the tablet stops being ancient history and becomes something far more practical and present. Let's start with the first condition we identified in part 1, the soul of fragmentation. The person whose sense of self has become so scattered, so divided between what they pretend to be and what they actually are, that there's no coherence left to speak of. The Sumerians understood something about this that modern psychology is only now catching up to. They called the remedy gathering the ka, not in a mystical sense, but in a brutally practical one. It meant you had to stop performing for different audiences. You had to stop being one person at work, another at home, another online, and another in your own mind. The scribe notes in the margin, and this detail was translated as damaged text, but it's actually quite clear, that the person who practices deliberate consistency, who aligns their private choices with their public statements, begins to solidify. They become coherent. The gates recognize them because there's actually someone there to recognize. This sounds simple until you actually try it. It means saying the thing you actually believe in the meeting, not the thing that's safe. It means your social media reflecting something true about you, not an optimized version. It means the person you are when no one is watching is fundamentally the same person you are when everyone is. The scribe understood that this kind of coherence can't be faked, and it can't be performed for just a little while and then abandoned. It has to become your actual operational system. And the tablet suggests, and this is crucial, that people who maintain this consistency report a specific sensation, a lightness, a reduction in the constant cognitive load of remembering who you're supposed to be in each context. You stop being haunted by the gap between yourselves. The second condition was consumption without receiving, the soul trapped in endless intake. And the counter practice here is equally specific. It's not about deprivation. It's not about rejecting all consumption. The Sumerians weren't ascetics, but they understood that a soul that only takes and never returns anything to the world becomes structurally depleted. There's an asymmetry that damages something essential. The practice was called the law of reciprocal movement. For every input, a deliberate output. For every piece of knowledge consumed, you teach someone. For every resource received, you contribute something of value. For every moment you spend absorbing content, you create something. This isn't karma in a supernatural sense. It's a recognition that your consciousness is shaped by the direction of your energy flow. If everything is flowing inward, your internal space becomes toxic. It begins to rot with unused potential. The tablet is very clear about this. People who practice reciprocal giving report that their consumption becomes meaningful again. They want less because they're no longer trying to fill a void. They're no longer eating because they're empty. They eat because food is nourishing. They consume information because it serves something they're building. The direction of their energy has been corrected, and with it, the quality of their experience transforms. The third condition was forgetting. The soul so caught in the present moment that it loses the thread of its own continuity. And here the counter practice is deceptively simple but requires genuine discipline. It's called maintenance of the thread. It means you have to deliberately keep your own history alive. You have to remember what you've learned. You have to revisit your own insights and build upon them instead of discovering the same truths over and over like someone with amnesia. The scribe notes that people who keep records, not obsessively but deliberately, of their own growth, their own patterns, their own realizations, report that time itself changes. It stops being a series of disconnected moments and becomes a continuous story. And consciousness, apparently, needs that continuity to cohere. Without it, you're just experiencing sequential moments. With it, you're actually living a narrative. This explains why the practice of keeping a genuine diary, not a performance for an audience, but an actual record of your own thought, was considered so essential. It's not narcissism. It's an anchor. It's a way of saying to your own consciousness, you existed before this moment, you will exist after it, and the person you're becoming is connected to the person you were. The fourth condition was substitution of symbols for truth. The soul so committed to the idea of progress, to systems, to metrics, that it lost sight of what those systems were actually supposed to measure. And the counter practice the scribe describes is almost funny in its directness. You have to periodically ask yourself what you're actually optimizing for. Are you maintaining your relationships or just hitting relationship targets? Are you pursuing knowledge or just collecting credentials? Are you building something real or just climbing a ladder that's leaning against the wrong wall? The tablet suggests that the soul that regularly performs this reality check, that asks itself whether its symbols still connect to truth, develops an immunity to this kind of self-deception. It sounds obvious, but it's not. Most people never do this. They spend their entire lives pursuing the representation of a good life rather than an actual good life. The symbol replaces the thing, the metric replaces the meaning, And by the time they realize it, they've organized their entire existence around measuring something that doesn't matter. The Sumerians called people who did this regularly the aligned ones, and the tablet attributes to them a specific kind of freedom, freedom from having to constantly defend their choices, because their choices are already aligned with their actual values. And the fifth condition, the soul afraid of its own becoming, the one so terrified of who it might have to grow into that it stays small on purpose. The counter practice here is the most demanding of all. It's called the practice of small becoming. And what it means is you have to deliberately embrace one small transformation at a time, not the enormous life change you're waiting for permission to make, not the complete reinvention you've been fantasizing about, but the actual next step, the slightly uncomfortable growth that's available to you right now. The tablet is explicit about this. The soul that practices small, consistent, voluntary transformation becomes fundamentally different from the soul that resists change. Not just different in attitude, different in structure. The cells of consciousness itself reorganize around the capacity for growth. And the scribe notes something crucial. This is the only condition where the practice is also the proof. You can't fake becoming. You either are changing or you're not. And the person who changes, even slightly, even uncomfortably, becomes someone who the gates recognize. Now, here's where this gets interesting. Because the tablet doesn't just list these 5 conditions and their counter practices and then stop. It goes further. It describes something the scribe calls the recognition phase, the moment when you realize you're already being tested, that the gates aren't something that only opens when you die. The gates are opening all the time, in smaller ways. Every moment where you're offered the chance to be coherent, you're being presented with a gate. Every opportunity to contribute instead of just consume, another gate. Every time you remember who you are in the context of who you've been, another gate. Every time you choose truth over the symbol of truth, another gate. Every time you grow instead of shrink, another gate. And the Sumerians understood something we've largely forgotten. You don't have to be perfect at any of these practices to begin the reversal. You just have to begin. You have to get the direction right. The soul that is moving toward coherence, even if imperfectly, is moving toward the gates. The soul that is practicing reciprocal energy, even if inconsistently, has changed the direction of its flow. The one that is maintaining the thread of its continuity, even if the record is spotty, is still creating the narrative spine that consciousness needs. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a much deeper resource available on this exact topic: how to identify which of these 5 conditions is most active in you right now, and a step-by-step protocol for what the Sumerians called gatekeeper recognition practices. This goes into the specific daily practices, the journal prompts, the decision frameworks, everything you need to actually move through this work. You'll find that resource in the pinned comment and in the description. It's quite detailed, and it's been updated based on what people have reported actually works in modern life. But here's what I want to emphasize before we finish. The reason this tablet was labeled damaged and buried for so long isn't because it was actually damaged. It was because it presented a problem for modern interpretation. Modern scholars are trained to see ancient texts as either primitive superstition or as metaphor for psychological concepts we already understand. But this tablet is neither. It's diagnostic technology. It's a practical system for identifying what's preventing you from becoming fully yourself. And the Sumerians, the same civilization that invented writing and mathematics and law, clearly believed this mattered enough to encode it in clay and send it forward. The modern implication is uncomfortable because it suggests that the gaps between who we are and who we could be aren't accidents. They're not inevitable. They're not the result of bad luck or bad circumstances. They're usually the result of one of these 5 choices we're actively making, consciously or unconsciously. And if they're choices, then they can be unmade. If they're patterns, they can be interrupted. If they're conditions, they can be reversed. The 5 souls that cannot pass the gates: the fragmented self, the endless consumer, the forgetter, the symbol worshiper, and the one afraid to become. These aren't descriptions of other people. They're descriptions of the ways we all trap ourselves. And the tablet exists to tell you something the gates themselves would tell you if you could hear them. It's not too late to change direction. It's not too late to start gathering yourself into coherence. It's not too late to start giving instead of just taking. It's not too late to remember who you actually are. It's not too late to align your life with what actually matters. And it's not too late to start growing into who you're meant to become. But the gates won't wait forever. And the Sumerians understood that very specifically. Not in a punishing way, but in the way that milk eventually sours if you don't take action. If you spend your entire life fragmenting yourself, one day you'll be too fragmented to gather back. If you spend your entire life consuming without contributing, one day you won't have anything left to draw from. If you spend your entire life forgetting, one day you won't remember who you were. If you spend your entire life chasing symbols, one day you'll have achieved everything and understood none of it. And if you spend your entire life afraid to change, one day change will come anyway, and you won't recognize yourself in it. The tablet is a gift. It's a practical map for the work you need to do right now while you're still here, while the gates are still opening. And the practices the Sumerians embedded in it, the gathering of the self, the practice of reciprocal giving, the maintenance of the thread, the regular reality check, and the courage to change, these aren't ancient and obsolete. They're foundational. They're the actual architecture of what it means to become someone whole enough to pass through. If you found this perspective on the 5 conditions useful, and especially if you recognize yourself in one or more of them, there's a complete action guide available in the description that walks you through not just identifying which ones are active in your life, but the exact practices for reversing each one. It includes decision trees, reflection exercises, and daily protocols that have been tested and refined. This is something you'll want to have on hand as you work through this, because knowing about the conditions is only the first step. Actually addressing them is where the real transformation happens. Thank you for watching this deep dive into what might be the most practical ancient text we have for understanding the barriers we create for ourselves. If this resonated with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss when we release new explorations into the knowledge systems the ancients left behind. Your continued support is what makes this work possible, and I genuinely appreciate being part of your curiosity. I'll see you in the next investigation into the forgotten wisdom that still applies to us today.